This week I talked to Graham Priest about paradoxes, contradictions and the metaphysics of logic. You're Professor of Philosophy, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Centre in New York.
That's right. The Graduate Centre of the City University of New York, called CUNY by its friends.
Great. So, and how long have you been there for? Because you were at Melbourne for a long time prior to that.
Yeah. Well, I started here in 2009, but for 3 years I was half and half. So I was half the year in New York, half the year in Melbourne. So I've been here full-time since about 2013. Right.
Okay, great. So let's dive into the philosophy, because that's after all what we're here for. You're very well known for defending a controversial position. I think that's fair to say. So I think one way of explaining how controversial it is as a bit of scene setting is with contrast to David Lewis. And so this has probably been said ad nauseum, but Lewis's view was that every logically possible thing exists concretely, and that view is often met with what he complained about it being met with an incredulous stare. And I've heard it said that he gave your view an incredulous stare, which goes to show the level of controversy surrounding the position. So it's so you're well known for defending the view that there are true contradictions. And maybe you'd like to say a few words just spelling out what that actually means.
Sure. No, you're dead right. David used to give me the incredulous stare. But just on David, who was a lovely man, he was always happy to sort of discuss in an open-minded fashion. And even though it's something he couldn't give any credence to, in my view, he never let that sort of interfere with free exchange of philosophical ideas. So he was a very open-minded philosopher. It's one of the things I sort of really appreciated about him. Anyway, so let me define dialetheism, and then let me talk about its unorthodoxy for a moment, since you raised that.
Sure.
So a dialetheia, that's a neologism which we coined a long time ago, is a pair of statements of the form P and not P, which are both true. So, things like the sun is shining, the sun is not shining, I'm in New York, I'm not in New York, the moon is made of green cheese, the moon is not made of green cheese, and so on. So these are contradictions, right? And the dialetheism is the view that some of these are true. So, both P and not P for some P. Now, the view that there are no dialetheias has been high orthodox in the history of Western philosophy. It's less secure in Eastern philosophy, but that's another story. So, in the Metaphysics book Gamma, Aristotle takes dialetheism in his sights, and it's clear that he thinks that some of his predecessors have been dialetheist. But he mounts a long and rather bad-tempered attack on dialetheism, which served to put the law of non-contradiction, which is kind of the opposite, into orthodoxy in Western philosophy. Now, the arguments are pretty bad. Now, that's not just my view, okay? Modern commentators struggle to figure out what the hell the arguments are, let alone that they work. I mean, some philosophers have tried to extract arguments that work, but they're hardly, it's hardly clear that Aristotle nailed it. And what is quite clear is lots of the arguments are beside the point, because he slides from arguing that it's not, it can't be the case that any contradictions are true, to arguing that it can't be the case that every contradiction is true. So, that's an obvious slide, and that's pretty clear. So Aristotle certainly didn't nail it. However, the magisterial authority of Aristotle served to kind of entrench the view in the history of Western philosophy. And it's kind of ironical that virtually every other Aristotelian view has been overturned, or at least seriously challenged in 2,500 years. This was kind of the last bastion, as it were, of Aristotelianism. But now, that's being challenged too. Now, it's not that there have been no dialetheists in the history of metaphysics, Western philosophy since Aristotle. I mean, the most obvious example is Hegel. But then, of course, interpreting Hegel is a kind of perilous enterprise, and some people do try to interpret Hegel consistently. I think that's kind of a misapplication of the principle of charity, but maybe we can come back to Hegel later. But it's clear that some people have endorsed contradictions since Aristotle, but very, very few. So the modern challenge to the law of non-contradiction, of which I and other people are a part, really is, I think, the most serious challenge to the law of non-contradiction for a long time. The only other kind of comparable figure being, I think, Hegel.
Okay, good. So I remember reading in the Metaphysics by Aristotle that he says something along the lines of that, well, not everything can be explained, right? I'm not quite sure I understand the argument, but then, as you said, maybe that's not a very good argument, and maybe that's why. But it seemed to me saying something like everything needs to be, well, not everything can be explained, otherwise you'd get an infinite regress of explanation, and that would be the same as nothing being explained. It's not clear to me that follows. But anyway, he then says, so there has to be a stopping point somewhere, and that may as well be the law of non-contradiction, because...
Well, he doesn't say it may as well be. He says it is. Okay, this is the most firm and secure principle. Now, he gives no argument for that. Well, okay, I suppose what follows that in the metaphysics is some kind of attempt to give an argument for it, except that he thinks you can't give an argument for it.
Right.
So
it's
basic.
irony.
Then he goes ahead and gives an argument for it.
So he's saying both that there's no argument for it and that is in itself somehow some kind of argument for it. It seems like it's a contradictory thing to say, almost.
Well, what he says is, okay, look, I can't give you an argument for it, but I can give you a sort of an ad hominem argument for it. So he brings in someone like me who objects, and then he says, as long as priest says something, I can knock him down. So it's kind of an Elenchik argument. So that's what he thinks he can do. But what's one of the things that's interesting about the passage, and it really is tangled, is that he has this one long argument, which is plausibly Elenchik, and then he's got 6 or 7 more arguments after that, in which the interlocutor just drops out. So, I mean, what does he think he's doing there? If he thinks, you can only give an Elenchik argument, and then he goes ahead and gives 6 or 7 non-Elenchik arguments. I mean, it's a very difficult passage to interpret.
Yeah, I mean, I once decided I would write a paper about the sea battle argument, which is kind of similar to him saying that the received view is that he's saying that the law of excluded middle fails for future contingents. However, when you look in detail at the passage, it starts to become less and less clear what's going on in that. And I found all sorts of commentators. It seemed to me that almost every conceivable position was taken by somebody on the issue over the thousands of years that people have been trying to read that passage. Yeah,
well, I mean, interestingly enough, in the same chunk of the metaphysics where Aristotle defends the law of non-contradiction, nothing is both true and false. He also defends the law of excluded middle. Everything is either true or false. But then you get this very strange chapter in De Interpretatione, which is the sea battle, and where he seems to argue that statements about the future, contingent statements about the future, such as that there'll be a sea battle tomorrow, are not yet metaphysically determined. So such statements are neither true nor false now. They'd be true or false in the future, but not now. And how you square that chapter from De Interpretatione with the metaphysics is, again, one of these interesting scholarly questions about which commentators on Aristotle argue.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, maybe we should park the detail about Aristotle's views for the moment, because regardless of what he thought, It's the received view in, let's say, Western metaphysics, that principle of
I
non-contradiction.
think that's fair. And that grounds the sort of the Lewis incredulous stare, as you raised.
Okay, great. So then you challenge it, and well, let me ask you then, what was it that, presumably you went from a state of being not a dialetheist to being a dialetheist? I mean, presumably you weren't born a dialetheist. So what was it that happened around that time?
I wasn't born a logician either. I wasn't born a logician either.
No.
Okay. So how did I get that? Okay, look, you're right. Look, my doctorate's in mathematical logic, and it's based on classical logic. And, I thought classical logic was pretty good. So that's that. But one thing, that one does as a logician is start to worry about things like Gödel's theorems. So Gödel's theorems are these really profound results in mathematical logic, which, okay, let's keep this sort of very informal for an informal audience. So that if you've got an appropriate theorem, appropriate sort of theory of arithmetic, so, you talk about numbers and adding them and so on, and provided it's sufficiently strong, there are going to be things that you can't prove in that system, even though they're true. And when you hear that, your ears prick up, because, hey, how do you know they're true if you can't prove them? Well, there's an obvious answer, namely that you can't prove them in that theory, but you can prove in some other stronger theory. But the more you start to think about this, the more puzzling that gets. So this was my route into dialetheism, and thinking about how mathematical proof works. I started to become sympathetic to the idea that maybe we should take seriously the thought that there are things in arithmetic about numbers which are both true and false, and they're and one of them is the kind of famous Gödel sentence, something like, you can't prove this sentence, or this sentence can't be proved. And there's an obvious paradox associated with that. So suppose you, let me see, suppose you can prove it, then it's true, so you can't prove it. That's contradiction. So you can't prove it. But hey, we've just proved it, so you can prove it. Sometimes this is called Gödel's paradox, right? And obviously there's a close similarity to other paradoxes of self-reference, like the liar paradox. So after I started thinking about Gödel's paradox, I was driven to think more generally about paradoxes of self-reference. And the most famous one is the liar paradox. We can go over that if you like. But the paradoxes of self-reference are a family of paradoxes that go back 2,500 years. But they turned up also in the foundations of mathematics at the beginning of the 20th century. And you might have thought that they were parlor games before that, although certainly the great medieval logicians did not interpret them in this way. But after the fact that they had arisen in the foundations of mathematics at the turn of the century, nobody any longer could treat them as mere parlor games. And I think it's true to say that what to say about the paradoxes have been a driving force of the development of logic in the 20th century. That there's hardly a great name in logic in the 20th century which hasn't addressed these issues. And most people, of course, have thought that these paradoxes, there must be something wrong with them, because after all, they end up, with a contradiction. And so they've tried to find a way out, and it's a mark of many of these paradoxes that there's been no consensus for 2,500 years. So the dialethic thought is, hey, maybe we've been barking up the wrong tree. The arguments that produce these paradoxes are actually veridical. They're an argument with a contradiction at the end. Maybe they really establish the contradiction. And if they do, then of course dialetheism is true. So that's the dialectic line on the paradox of self-reference. So, that's sort of where it all started a long time ago, the first, 5 or 8 years of us thinking about these things in the dialectic community.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. So I hadn't appreciated the where this had come from in your line of thinking was from Gödel. But obviously now you put it like that, the similarity between the Gödel sentence and the Lie sentence is striking, obviously. I suppose it's surprising because you were willing to take the step that to others had seemed unthinkable, right? I mean, I guess people had been confronted with these so-called paradoxes, and then the general, bread and butter strategy of a logician or a philosopher or mathematician when faced with this type of puzzle is to try and avoid contradicting oneself, right? To find a solution which gets around the paradox, right? But you've taken quite a radical step, it seems, and to some, this is the unacceptable step to say, well, maybe that sort of basic guiding principle is to be thrown out the window here. So is that because you felt that the consistent solutions that were on the marketplace were defective in some way or another? Because there are various solutions, right?
Yeah, indeed. That's partly the story. I think it's fair to say that when it comes to these paradoxes nowadays, there's still no consensus. So the only thing that people agree about is that every solution, every consistent solution, is unacceptable in its own way. And there are reasons for this, which we can talk about if you like. But that is kind of one reason why you might think, well, maybe we have been barking up the wrong tree. So let's try something else.
Sure. Yeah.
Now, at this point, the story kind of engages with some developments in technical formal logic. So we won't go into these much, but in sort of the standard received logic of the 20th century, there's a principle of inference called explosion, or if you want to give it its medieval name, ex falso quod libet, which says, roughly speaking, from a contradiction, everything follows.
Sure.
So suppose you subscribe to that principle and you're a dialetheist, it follows that everything is true. And that seems pretty crazy. I mean that's a much more insane view than dialetheism, right?
Right. Then you seem to have lost the ability to distinguish between anything.
Correct. So, the thought that the liar sentence is both true and false is one thing. The fact that I'm a frog, wait, hey, that's crazy, okay? So, around the 1960s, formal logicians started to develop theories where this principle of explosion was not valid. So these have this technical name of paraconsistent logic. So one thing is pretty clear. If you want to be a sane dialetheist, you probably want to use a paraconsistent logic. Now, paraconsistent logic was itself frowned upon for a long time. People thought, because it gave you the ability to kind of accept contradictions without collapsing into a heap, paraconsistent logic in its early years got a very bad rap. But that's now past. Paraconsistent logic is a well-established branch of logic with its own kind of code number in mathematical reviews and so on. And we know that it's technically coherent. There are many systems, and they've all got, proof theories, semantics, algebras, and they make perfectly good technical sense. So the most obvious line of defense, or the most obvious line of attack on dialetheism, was that it was technically incoherent because of the explosion principle. And that doesn't stack up because the paraconsistent logics are completely coherent. Now, they might not be right. That's another story. But you can't simply say, oh, the view's technically incoherent. So then you start to ask yourself, well, okay, well, it's technically incoherent. Now, why should we suppose that dialetheism is false? And of course, you're not going to get a technical answer to that. You're going to dig into deep philosophical arguments. So naturally, you go back to Aristotle and you have a look at his arguments and see that they're pretty crap. And then you start to think, well, are there other good arguments? And one thing we've learned, I think, over the last 40 years is that if there are good arguments against dialetheism, they're not simple-minded things. They're going to be hard. And for that reason, even if dialetheism is false, if we do eventually come to understand why, we will have learned something that's really important. But I mean, in the early years of dialetheism, people just didn't want to engage with the question because it seemed so obviously wacky, the incredulous stare. And it's not till you actually push people that they actually engage with the problem. This is how it sort of happened historically. So look, I mean, philosophy is full of strange ideas, and life is short, and of course, you're not going to engage with ideas that you think are crazy. So I can understand why people didn't give the view the time of day for a long time. But I've done a lot of traveling over the years, and sometimes dialetheism comes up, and they say, well, you can't accept contradiction. And you say, why? And then, if they're reading a journal article, and you can close the book, put it aside. But when you're standing face to face with someone like me who says, why? Then, you have to engage. And it was in a sort of series of encounters of that kind that I think a lot of people started to realize that it really wasn't as straightforward as they had thought. And then a number of the better logicians started to engage with the question, like Humphrey Fields, Stuart Shapiro, Mark Sainsbury. They all realized there's something really difficult about this issue. And I think amongst the people who really understand what's going on now, that would be generally conceded. I mean, dialetheism, there are more dialetheists now than there were 30 years ago. We're still in a very minority position, but at least amongst thinking logicians, the position is taken seriously in a way that it wasn't 30 years ago.
Yeah,
With people sorry?
It's on the map, as it were, these days.
It's on the map. It's something that has to be reckoned with. But that's, I mean, if you talk to philosophers in general, not people who work in this area, you still get the incredulous stare more often than not.
And I guess I think that in conversations with people about this, what often happens is the objections basically turn into being question begging, in the sense that they say, well, because you can't have a contradiction, can you? And it's like, well, but that's the thing that's in question. And so it's what becomes difficult, I think, is to see how to articulate what's at stake with such a bold proposal. I think Lewis said I read this letter that he wrote declining to be part of a book on contradictions, where he said something like, well, I just feel like there's no common ground. There's nothing for me to stand on to defend my position once that's called into question. And I think that
He did say that. I think it was one of the few things that Dave was wrong about, because, I mean, you can argue about it, and we have been about it now for 40 years. Now, standardly, when you argue with philosophers, if they get you into a contradiction, they've won. End of story. Now, dialetheism takes away that weapon of critique, and it's a very powerful weapon. And so you can understand why people think that they have nothing left once this weapon goes. But this just isn't true. Shall I explain one reason why?
Go for it, yeah, of course, yeah, please.
Well, look, a person says, what I'm telling you now is false. Is what they've said true or false? Well, if it's true, well, they've just said that it's false, so it's false. But if it's false, hey, they've just said that it's false, so it seems to be true. Okay, that's the simplest version of the paradox. And that's actually the original version of Eubulides, I think. So it's a paradox, it's about truth. And of course, truth is a really hardcore philosophical notion about which we have all kinds of arguments. So the paradoxes, like the liar, are embedded in a theory of truth. Now, there are many theories of truth, of course. And one thing you're trying to do when you solve the liar paradox is to embed this kind of problem in a theory of truth. Now, there are many theories of truth. And a dialectic theory, which says, well, truth is such that this particular argument establishes a truth, and there's going to be lots more to it than that. But if you're a dialetheist, you're going to end up with an inconsistent theory of truth, and then there are various consistent theories of truth. So without going to too many of the details of this, what is now on the table is a bunch of theories of truth, some of which are consistent, some of which are not. So now you have a methodological issue of choosing which is the best theory. And there are many, many criteria of theory choice. Some people think that inconsistency is a knockdown argument against a theory. If once you've sort of leaped the hurdle, that's no longer true. But there are many other criteria, like adequacy to the data, like fruitfulness, like simplicity, like, there's this whole bunch of criteria. How can you argue against an inconsistent theory? Well, you show that there's a consistent theory which is much better on all these other criteria. It's simpler, it's more fruitful, it's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So you've got plenty of methodological weapons to argue against an inconsistent theory of truth, especially since you might think that an inconsistent theory of truth starts with a black mark against it. And even dialetheists might agree with that. It is a black mark, but it's not an ungainsayable black mark.
Yeah, okay, sure. So I think that one of the issues is one of these kind of like bad reputation things that people who are coming to this for the first time might think is that when you take that step towards dialetheism, that then somehow your standards are lowered, right? So you're not being like rigorous or critical anymore. And that, when confronted with a problem, you're just going to go, oh, well, it's probably just contradictory, and shrug your shoulders and not even try and solve it. And that's not the case, right?
That's not the case. So you're right that people say, hey, it's a cheap solution, but it's not for several reasons. First of all, you just can't accept the contradiction. You've got to construct a theory of what's driving the contradiction, and they're going to be consistent theories as well. So you've got to defend the theory. And one thing I'd have to do is something we did for a long time, work on theories of paraconsitent logic, which are going to be involved in this to show that they are coherent, and that requires a lot of technical work. But the second reason, it's the third reason, there are paradoxes where you just cannot do this. So, for example, take the Sorites paradox, and listeners may not know what this is, but let me prove you're a poached egg. No, let me prove you're a scrambled egg. All right. So if I take you and I exchange one molecule of your body with a molecule of scrambled egg, then you're still you. You're still Alex, right? In fact, whenever you're you, and I replace one molecule of you with a molecule of scrambled egg, then you're still you. Okay, so you can see where we're going, right? We start with you now. I get out my scalpel or knife or whatever, and I start replacing your molecules with a molecule of scrambled egg one by one. And every time I do this, it's still you. Okay. In the end, when I replace every atom of your body with a molecule of scrambled egg, it's scrambled egg. But obviously, you're not scrambled egg, but it's still you. So this is a Sorites argument, sometimes called the little by little argument, and it proves that you are and are not a scrambled egg. Now, this is crazy. As I said, suppose the liar sentence is both true and false is one thing. It's highly abstract. You can relegate it to the kind of domain of logical theorization. To think that you might be a scrambled egg. Well, that's the thing of which that's the sort of thing of which insanity is made. Okay, so you can't just accept this contradiction. And in many ways, I think the Sorites paradox is much harder than the paradox of self-reference, just because even a dialethic move is not open to you.
Okay.
So, there are no cheap solutions to any paradox. Any paradox is going to demand work, because something plausible is going to have to go. That's what makes the damn thing a paradox. and explaining why you found this thing which is paradoxical, so why you found this thing plausible, why you can overturn it without disaster. This is all hard philosophical work that has to be done. So there are no easy paradox solutions, even dialectic ones.
Okay, good. So the general idea then is that there are these puzzles, paradoxes, one of which being the liar paradox, I guess also Russell's paradox, or the Gödel sentence. And well, one has to say something about them if you want to respond to it. The job of a philosopher is to try and say something, construct a theory which puts these problems into context, or solve them if possible. Right? And all of the solutions on the table for these particularly difficult nuts to crack involve giving up something that's pretty damn fundamental. There's no easy solutions to any of these things.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a paradox if there were an easy solution, right?
Right. Okay, good. So so let's see. One of the ways that people, I think, perhaps naively try and respond to something like the liar paradox is to say something like, well, look, I'm not going to say that it's both true and false, because that's the orthodoxy that I subscribe to, that nothing can be both true and false, or we can't have both the same proposition and its negation true at the same time. But maybe I can get around this by saying something like, look, the liar sentence is neither true nor false, right? So then I just don't have to, I can sort of somehow sideline it in that way. Now, you've got quite an interesting response to this, which is characterized as the revenge of the liar paradox. So maybe you could just say a few words about this notion of revenge and how it stops these types of responses.
Okay, so look, I can't claim credit for this argument because it's a very old argument and lots of people know it. But the thought is that when you construct a consistent theory which is supposed to solve these paradoxes, it always seems to turn out that you can deploy the machinery involved in the solution to kind of ratchet up the paradox and to produce something like a strengthened paradox. Now, this seems to be a feature of virtually every consistent solution to the liar paradox. Look, let me say something. Everything you say in this area is contentious, right? So anything I say, someone's going to contest, and they'll contest what I've just said. But generally speaking, most people think that virtually every consistent solution to the liar paradox is going to have an extended paradox. So let's take a very simple example so you can see roughly how this kind of thing works. So let's take the liar paradox. It's a sentence that says this sentence is false. If it's true, it's false, but if it's false, it's true. You just seem to be stuck with a contradiction. Okay, but hey, if it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true. But maybe it's neither. Natural thought. And if it's neither true nor false, we seem to be home scot-free. And maybe you are. And this sort of solution has appealed to many people for obvious reasons. But let's think a little bit harder. All right, so things can be true, things can be false, and maybe they can be neither. All right. Now, I want you to think about this claim. This very sentence that I'm telling you now is either false or it's neither true nor false. You got a choice, a disjunction, right? Mm-hmm. Let's think about this. Is it true? Well, if it's true, it's either false or neither true nor false. Both ways you've got a contradiction. So could it be false? Well, certainly if it's false, it's either false or neither true nor false. It's one of the two possibilities. So if it's false, it's either false or neither true nor false. Hey, that's what it says, so it's true. That's the problem. All right, but now we have the third saving possibility, that it's neither true nor false. Okay. So suppose it's neither true nor false. Well, if it's neither true nor false, then it's either false or neither true nor false, same as the last case. And that's what it says. So it's true. We're back with the problem. So this is a kind of typical extended paradox. And it's one of the reasons why consistent solutions are highly problematic, because they seem to generate these things. Now, some people have held that a dialethic solution is subject to extended paradox as well. But at least as a first move, this is not going to be the case, because an extended paradox is a paradox and it's going to give you a contradiction. Hey, but the aim of a dialethic solution was never to get rid of contradictions, it was to tame them. Okay, so what's a kind of knockdown argument? Well, if you can make an extended argument stick against a consistent solution, that's really bad news for the theorist. But merely showing that the dialethic solution has an extended paradox which shows it to be inconsistent, well, that's no big news, because there was an inconsistency in the first place, and this is just one more of them, okay? And it's not a contradiction of the kind, you know, you're a frog. It's a contradiction that's kind of obviously in the same ballpark as the lie paradox.
So would it be the type of, let me see, if you were to say, I'm thinking of, is there a version of revenge which works by suggesting something like, when you take the dialethic solution and you say that the lie sentence is both true and false, but then that leads you to have to accept a whole bunch of other things being contradictory too. I mean, I know it's not straightforwardly via explosion, but is there some kind of iterated form of the lie paradox where, like, you want to say...
I mean, the obvious kind of analog to the extended lie paradox in the neither case goes like this. Consider the sentence, this sentence is false only. So it's false and not both true and false. Okay? Then, you know, we won't go through the reasoning now, but it's an exercise for your listeners. You can end up with the thought that that sentence is both false only and not false only. So it's false and not true, but it's false and true. Okay, that's the contradiction you end up in. But it's not clear that that contradiction is any worse than the original contradiction you had, that the liar sentence itself was both true and false. I mean, it seems to be in the same bailiwick. Okay, if you don't balk at the first, why should you balk at the second? Now, these things have been discussed now for a long time, and these things are only ever the first move in a game. So there are all kinds of moves that get made at this point. People try and turn the screws and so on. So this is not the place to go into the dialectic of all these things. All I'm pointing out is that the most obvious analog of the extended paradox in the dialectic case is no good, just because it doesn't do any good to show that the dialectic position is inconsistent. We knew that. Okay, so you need more. So it's a kind of knockdown argument. If you can get it to stink in the gap case, that's the neither case. It's not a kind of a magic bullet. In the glut case, that's the both true and false case. Yeah, sure. So is it correct then that on a dialethic logic that reductio ad absurdum is like not a valid way of arguing then, presumably? The answer to your question is generally yes. You can formulate the reductio principle in various different ways, and you may well want to draw a distinction between the various different ways, but let's not go into the technicalities. As a general answer, it's not, a reductio argument is not going to work, because if you show that a view is, a reductio is an argument which takes some view and shows it leads to an inconsistency. Now, if dialetheism is on the table, then that is not a knockdown argument. This takes us back to the question of, arguing, where we were some time ago about arguing against a philosophical position by showing it's contradictory. It's not guaranteed to work. But that doesn't mean that it's never good. If you can show that the view is inconsistent, then at least once you're doing the sort of the evaluation of the theory in which it contains contrasted with other theories, well, the fact that it's inconsistent is, let's agree, a mark against it. So it's going to be a significant fact that a theory is inconsistent. And I think there are plenty of views where an inconsistent solution really doesn't work, such as the problem of evil, for example, which we can talk about if you like, but that's another whole big topic. But also, I mean, we use reductio arguments a lot where no one would really think to find them problematic. Of course, in classical mathematics, we use reductio arguments all the time, such as, for example, to prove that, I don't know, the square root of 2 is not a rational number. That's usually done as a reductio, or it can be done as a reductio argument. No one seriously doubts that. Why not? Well, because you're dealing with a domain which you've got every reason to believe is consistent. And if you've got every reason to believe the domain is consistent, and you show that something leads to a contradiction, you've got a very good reductio argument, because it can't be the case if the domain is consistent one. Now, okay, then the next question is, well, how do you know when the domain is consistent? That's an important question. But leave that aside as a separate question. If you are in a domain that you've got every reason to believe is consistent, then a reductio argument is going to be perfectly good.
Sure. Okay. So this leads me on to another question, which is that I naturally assumed that a dialethetic version of paraconsistent logic, right? So a logic which doesn't have explosion and for which the principle of non-contradiction is false, or at least it's not a principle, let's say. That's a non-classical logic in the sense that it's a revision of classical logic, right? I mean, like, after all, one of those kind of principles of classical logic, at least two of those principles, let's say, both explosion and non-contradiction, are false in that. Is it fair to say that you can see it as an extension of classical logic, in the sense that because you have some contradictions but not triviality, that means you've kind of got a consistent part to the logic, right? It's that you could still talk about certain areas and, in a sense, use classical logic in a bit like the way that you can use Newtonian physics in most situations. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Let me explain a bit more why, but before we do that, let's nail this term classical logic.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so classical logic is a theory of reasoning, validity, that was invented at the end of the 19th century by Frege, and then it was developed by other logicians in the early part of the 20th century, like Hilbert and Russell and Gödel and so on. So historically, classical logic is a very recent phenomenon. People have been arguing about logic for 2,500 years in the West, and they've disagreed about many things. Okay, they haven't disagreed much about the principle of non-contradiction, but they've certainly disagreed about the principle of explosion. So the earliest systematic logic we have, or at least one of them, is Aristotle's syllogistic, and this is paraconsistent. Aristotle wouldn't have had a bar with a dialetheia, but his own logic was such that contradictions do not necessarily imply everything. Contradictions imply things in some moods of the syllogism and not others. And Aristotle points this out himself, right? And all the great medieval logicians argued about validity concerning modality and time and conditionals. And okay, so logic is an historically contentious subject. We've been arguing about it for a long time. And okay, there's been a sort of relative consensus since about the start of the 20th century. But now that's slowly starting to sort of crumble a bit. And look, hey, classical logic was invented for a particular purpose, namely to do justice to the mathematics of its day. I mean, Frege and Russell wanted to show how you could establish the mathematics of the day, and it does a pretty good job of that. But that was where you got it from. Now, why should you suppose that an argument that is designed to reason about that stuff is also going to be good for reasoning about other areas like vagueness or the law or time or paradoxes? Now, maybe it is, but you can't just assume that it is. So, the simple assumption, which is made in first courses in logic, that classical logic's got to be right to reason about anything, is completely unobvious. All right, so that's just, me getting that bit of thing off my chest about classical logic. Now, come back to your question. Can you see dialectic logic as an extension of classical logic? And the answer is yes, for the following reason. Although okay, let me put this as simply as I can. When you theorize about logic, then nearly always in the logic, you're going to define validity as truth preservation over a domain of situations, shall we call them. So for something to be a valid inference, you want it to, preserve truth, whatever reality is like. So a valid inference is going to be one such that in any situation where the premise is a truth, the conclusion is true. Okay, we can argue about what a situation is. And in fact, that's one of the things we do. But notice that there's then going to be an inverse relationship between all the situations you have and the number of logical principles you have. So the more situations you have, the fewer principles you expect to be valid, because there are going to be more situations which provide kind of counterexamples. So the size of the class of situations is inversely proportional in general to the size of the class of valid inferences. Now, if you move from classical theory, where you've got situations where things are either true or false, not both, not neither, and you move to a broader class of situations where you've got all those, but you might have some where things can be both true and false, maybe some where things are neither true or false, then you've expanded your domain of situations. Correspondingly, the collection of valid inferences is going to contract. And that's what happens. An explosion goes, right? However, the contraction of the valid principles is one thing, but the flip side of that is that you've just got more situations than you had. So in that sense, you've got a generalization of the situation where you had only some situations, namely the kind of classical ones. So, what a dialethetic logician might say to a classical logician is, hey, there's nothing wrong with your logic. You've just missed a bunch of cases which you haven't considered possibly before. Wittgenstein in, I think it's the Remarks on the Foundation of Mathematics, says that we're often gulled by an inadequate diet of examples.
I like that example.
And this is exactly one of those cases where you might think, hey, if you think about it, most of the cases you think about are consistent situations. All right, if you don't think much further, maybe you're going to kind of suppose all situations are like that. But hey, well, let's start to worry about problem cases with self-reference and time and motion and law and if you look at a kind of broader diet of examples, things are not so clear anymore.
And that makes it seem like maybe the easier, more handy analogy is not necessarily between Newtonian. Well, maybe this is the same thing, but between Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometries, I guess, right? So you might see something like, the idea that parallel lines will never meet is a tautology or something. Well, yeah, that's true, but only in all of those situations which are kind of Euclidean, let's say. And if that's your diet of examples, and yes, and it's true in all of the examples, but if you consider spaces which are curved or something, then you might find that parallel lines get further apart from each other.
Exactly. So there's a beautiful theory of geometry, late 19th century, called Riemannian theory, which defines a geometry in terms of the curvature of the space. And space can have various curvatures, positive, negative, variable, constant. And what happens when you just insist that curvature is zero uniformly, you get Euclidean geometry. So again, the Riemannian theory of manifolds is precisely this generalization where Euclidean geometry drops out as a special case.
I see. Great. So then that makes the analogy perfect, right? So that then the Riemannian theory is an extension of Euclidean geometry rather than a replacement. It's not just saying, yeah, it's geometry, but with like different axioms. It's saying those axioms are recoverable as a kind of limit case in the more general theory. And is it fair to say then that with the dialethetic paraconsistent logic, you can sort of recover classical logic in, it's not really a limit case, but in a certain subset of the cases that the paraconsistent logician considers classical ones?
In much the same sense. So just as, a Euclidean is going to say, hey, well, just as a Riemannian is going to say to the Euclidean geometer, okay, what you've done is interesting, you've got a bunch of cases there, but we can consider more complex cases. So the dialetheist is going to say to the classical logician, hey, what you've done is there, you've got a nice bunch of cases, but there are just some more of them, which sort of generalizes the theory to, shall we say, a broader space, using kind of space in the mathematician sense.
Mm. Okay, great. So I think maybe we should move on to talk in more detail about how to think about. Okay, so let me try and set this up clearly then. One way of thinking about it was, we've got some candidate contradictions, which are paradoxes from set theory, or things like the liar sentence, which someone might be not that bothered about, in the sense that they're very abstract, and you might think, well, these things are kind of quirks of language or something, right? They're products of a formal system, and that's it, right? And when we were just talking then about there being kind of a classical area somehow, and maybe a non-classical or inconsistent area, someone might want to say, I'm going to just rest with non-contradiction as a metaphysical principle that covers all the things that exist, in some kind of robust sense, concretely. And inconsistency is relegated to these mere linguistic or formal constructions or something, right? But you want to take a stronger line than that, it seems to me. While you seems like you do accept that for the formal paradoxes, the inconsistent solutions offer sometimes the best theory, you also put forward a metaphysical account such that there are, let's say, real contradictions, like in the world. The world itself manifests inconsistencies. And I think this is fascinating. I invite you to spell out how you see these things in the world.
All right. Look, first of all, there are logicians, dialetheists, who held the position that the only dialetheists are those that arise because of the paradox of self-reference. J.C. Beale holds that view, or at least held the view at one time. I'm not quite sure of his view at the moment, but he certainly held that view when he wrote his last book. Now, are there contradictions, are there dialetheism in the world, as opposed to this kind of abstract logical space? Well, that really depends what you mean by world. Wittgenstein, Proposition 1 of the Tractatus, the world is all that is the case. So, if that's the world, then you're just asking whether there are any true contradictions. But, okay, you mean something more robust than that. So yes, I think there are contradictions in a more robust sense than that. Dialetheism in a more robust sense than that. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first is a kind of transition to something much more hardcore, but it's an interesting bridge. I've never personally thought that the most transparent examples of dialetheism are those concerning the paradox of self-reference, because there's so much to argue about with those. I've always thought that the most transparent dialetheism concern law. So, for example, a duly constituted legislature can't make some things true or false. So you can't pass a law that the moon is 3 miles from the earth, or it's made of blue cheese or whatever. That's not the domain of law. But there are some things that a legislature can do by an act of duly constituted fiat. What they can do is give people rights and take them away. So, if the Parliament or the Congress or whatever passes a law to say that women, Aboriginals, Jews are not allowed to vote, well, then that's the law in that country, in that jurisdiction, right? Whether you think the law is good or bad is another matter. But you can give people rights or take them away in this legal process. Now, let's suppose that a duly constituted legislature passes the following legislation. It has two clauses. So it might be that, let's say, all property owners have the right to vote, and no Aboriginals have the right to vote. And you can imagine that when this law was passed, the thought that an Aboriginal, be they a Native American Indian or Australian Aborigine, the thought that such a person could hold property was just, inconceivable, incredible. There's a time in Australian history where Aboriginals weren't even thought of as people, let alone having the right to own property. It's a very dark area of Australian history. Okay, so you can imagine that that law is passed, and as long as it remains the case that no Aboriginal person has property, the law is perfectly consistent. But laws change, and they change piecemeal, and they change over time, and you can imagine that as social mores change, and as the law changes because of case law, precedent, and so on, an Aboriginal comes to hold property, and then rocks up at the polling booth and demands to vote. That person does not have the right to vote because they're an Aboriginal, but they have the right to vote because they're a property holder. Now, the law is patently inconsistent, and why it's inconsistent is transparent. It's because the legislature has made these things laws by fiat as they can. Now, of course, the law, a function of the law is to solve practical issues. And if this situation were to arise, obviously it would not be very practical. So what would happen in this kind of case is the law will be changed. And it will be changed either by the legislature changing the legislation, or more likely by a judge interpreting the law. These are both changes of law, right? But notice that the reason that this change of the law was necessary was precisely because the situation was inconsistent before that. So before the change in law, the situation was dialethetic, and that's precisely why the law needed to be changed. So this is, whether you want to call these things contradictions in the world, again, as I say, it depends on how you understand the world. There are contradictions maybe in the legal world, but we're not yet at the kind of hardcore physical world, which is, why I gave you this kind of midway case to start with.
I think that's a good example of a midway case. I accept that. And part of me feels like in that case, if I sat down and thought about it for a while, I could tell you a story or something which meant that, I feel like it's something like if somebody intends to do something and I don't know, later on changes their mind and intends the opposite thing, that it feels like it's something like that with this legal case, that we are sort of constructing something which is some kind of amalgamation out of people's intentions or something, and that we could somehow brush that into the non-concrete part of what there is or something. So while I think that it's just patently true that there are obviously cases where the law is inconsistent. It's something, when you're asking for an example of a metaphysically manifested contradiction, it feels unsatisfying to get there.
Sure. So I mean, the really hard metaphysical cases, so to speak, are going to be concerning the world and sich, physical reality, metaphysical reality, and law is not like that, precisely because it's obviously a social construction in some sense, and what's true and false in law depends on what people do. And we don't normally think of the world and sich as like that, although some people do, but that's another story.
Sure. Yeah.
All right, so let us pass on. Now, earlier I talked about Hegel. Okay. there's a lot to be said about Hegel and dialetheism, but let's just focus on a very small part of it. Hegel had a theory of motion, and he tells us in the Logic that, well, he says, what is it to be in motion? Now, to be in motion is not simply to be here at one instant of time and here at another, but it's to be here and not here, or to be in both places at one and the same time. And we're dealing with a point particle here. Think of a point particle. So if it's here, it's not here, okay, but for Hegel, to be in motion is to be both here and not here at one and the same point of time. These are words, well, they're in German, but I translate roughly, okay? This is one of the reasons why it's really hard to interpret Hegel as a non-dialetheist, because he's got these just flat statements of contradictions. Anyway, let's not go into Hegel exegesis now.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I might think, well, what the bloody hell is going on here? You know, why? And Hegel is quite clear that he's spinning off a tradition of the old dialecticians, as he puts it, and he has in mind mainly Zeno. Now, Zeno had many famous paradoxes, and many of them have found, I think, quite heavy resolutions because of mathematical developments in the 19th century. But one I don't think has, and one I don't think Hegel thinks has, is the paradox of the arrow. So the paradox of the arrow goes like this. You know, you've got an archer, and they fire this arrow at the target, and it goes from the bow, hits the target, if the guy is lucky. Now, consider any particular point of the motion of the arrow. That's an instant. How much progress does the arrow make in a single instant? Answer, 0. Because if it made some progress, the progress would have to be spread out over time, and this is but an instant. All right, good. So at any one instant, progress made equals 0. But of course, progress made in the entire journey is just the sum of the progress made at each instant. Now, adding 0 to 0 as many times as you like is 0. Even adding 0 to 0 infinitely many times is 0. So it would appear to be the case that the motion is impossible because it can't make progress. It can't make progress any instant, so it can't make progress any collection of instants. Now, this is Zeno. What was Hegel's solution to it? Well, okay, that's what's driving his thought. Look, take the arrow at any instant. Progress made at that instant is not 0, because the fact that it's in motion means that, okay, it's here all right, but it's already not here. It's already gone a little bit further, and maybe it hasn't quite reached there yet. It's kind of lagging behind. So to be in motion is precisely to occupy more than just this local point, even though it's a point particle, if you like. So progress made at any instant is non-zero. That's how it manages to make progress overall, because it makes non-zero progress at every instant. So this was Hegel's theory of motion. And you know, it's not the orthodox theory of motion, which is quite different. But you can see what was driving him to have this theory of motion. And I, confess to finding this argument pretty persuasive. And there is something very puzzling about freeze frame theories of motion. So for the freeze frame is something like the orthodox theory of motion, sort of Russellian theory of motion. So what is motion? It's just like, when you get an old-fashioned movie film, there are a number of frames, right? And each frame is perfectly still, but you just run these things so fast together that it appears to be in motion. That's the freeze frame theory of motion. That's pretty orthodox theory nowadays. And there's something deeply unsatisfying about that, because one's inclined to think that, that's not really motion. Motion is some kind of genuine flux. If you got something at rest and you spliced the bits of it together very bloody fast so it appeared to be in motion, it wouldn't. It would still be at rest. I mean, I find this argument very persuasive.
So is the problem with the orthodox theory that it doesn't provide you any account of intrinsic motion, right? Like there's no, like the only difference between something being in motion and something being at rest is where it is at different times, earlier or later than that. And
absolutely.
If you just have one snapshot on its own, there's nothing you can say which would determine whether or not that thing is in motion.
Absolutely. In the sort of freeze frame theory of motion, motion is not intrinsic, motion is relational. So whether it's something that's in motion at one point in time really depends on wherever else it is in a kind of neighborhood of that point of time. Exactly.
And so the Hegelian account offers an alternative by giving you intrinsic motion. That's right, is it? So just walk me through this. So it seems, I find it difficult to, obviously I can see that this Hegelian account, let's call it the spread hypothesis, right, which is how you describe it, which is that there's this kind of a non-zero area around the instant that we're thinking about, slightly before and slightly after, where the particle is there, it is slightly ahead of itself and slightly behind itself, let's say. But if we restrict ourselves to just looking at the moment, the instant on its own, how on the Hegelian account can I tell whether that particle is in motion or not? Because it seems to me the difficulty we just observed with the orthodox account, and it seems to me that if the Hegelian offers an alternative, does it look blurry or something?
Well, to be in motion is precisely to be in a contradictory state. It's to be here and not here at the same time. You asked me what it looks like?
Well,
you know what it looks like, okay? Take a clock, okay? And take a clock with a second hand, which sort of have the sweep hand, okay? There's something very puzzling about this. You cannot see the minute hand move, but you can actually see the second hand moving. That's what it looks like.
So our experience isn't of a series of still frames, one replacing the other. Our experience is intrinsically, yeah, okay, I get that, and that does seem right. So I'm thinking now of something like Husserl, who has a theory of what conscious experience is like, where it has a little bit of the future and a little bit of the past in it, right? A bit of protension and retention.
Correct.
And so does this come down then to psychological experience being contradictory? I mean, have we actually drilled down to a metaphysical contradiction?
Well, with Husserl, you are not in metaphysical territory yet, just because it's one of his principles that you've taken the methodological stance of an epoche. So you're interested only in analysis of consciousness as such, not the world. That's another question. But the argument I'm giving you for motion being inconsistent is not wedded to the epoche, quite the contrary. It says, hey guys, the world is really like that.
Yeah, I get it. So,
so I brought up the appearance only because you asked me what does it look like.
Okay, so maybe my question was misleading then. So what I was asking was, let's say on the orthodox picture, if you take one of those still frames, there would be nothing about it which you could tell whether or not the thing is in motion, right? Correct. And on the Hegelian account, that's not true, right? So there is something about it which will tell you whether or not it's in motion. So I guess my question is, what is it?
Well, it's inconsistent, okay? So if the damn thing is at rest, its state is consistent. It's there and nowhere else. Whereas if it's in motion, it's there and somewhere else.
But how could you tell whether it was also somewhere else if all you're restricting your attention to is that one instant?
Well, how do you tell the state of how do you tell what the instantaneous state of anything is? You can't observe it because it's instantaneous. you look to your theory to tell you what's happening at the instant.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, but that sounds like a kind of an epistemological problem where, like, that's true, but then if that's right, then you could launch that against the orthodox account as well. Like, I can't actually look at what on earth.
You're exactly right. Your question was, how do you know what the state is an instant? That is an epistemological question. And
Yeah,
we're all stuck with that, right? Classical and non-classical.
I suppose I'm trying to, and maybe it's, again, I'm not being clear, but I suppose when you're saying that there's on the orthodox account, there's nothing intrinsic to the state of the particle, which says whether or not it's in motion.
Yep.
Right? And one way of expressing that, maybe a shorthand way of expressing it, would be if you looked at it, you couldn't know whether it was in motion or not. And I suppose in some sense that is misleading, but you follow what I'm saying. So really I was trying to tease out of you the criteria or something which makes the difference. And because it seems to me that what you want to say is that in the Hegelian account, what makes the difference is whether or not the particle also is at a different location. And that seems to me that it's relational again, because we're talking about some relation that this instant.
No, because at that instant, okay, of time, it's in a contradictory state. It's here and it's somewhere else. Okay, it certainly makes reference to somewhere else. It's not sort of a solipsism, a spatial solipsism of the instant, as it were. But there's very clear criterion. On a Hegelian account, something to be at rest is for it to be in this state, it's here and nowhere else. And if it's in motion, then it's here and it's somewhere else. That's the criterion. Now, how do you know which of these two is the case? Well, then that brings us back to the epistemological question.
Yeah. Let's just say we can't know these things. I'm quite happy to bracket the epistemological question. I feel like we'll just grant that we can't really look in a microscope at instants or something, because presumably these things are supposed to be a genuine instance and thus below the Planck time, right? And then
once you quantize all this stuff, then it gets much more complicated. So I've been talking at the moment on the assumption that space is classical. How quantum theory affects this? Well, I don't think I can go into this because I don't know enough about quantum mechanics. I don't think anyone else knows much about quantum theory of space and time. But let me change the subject again, because you're asking about contradiction of reality, and we've talked about law, we've talked about metaphysics. Now let's talk about physics.
Okay.
I'm not going to suggest that any of our physical theories at the moment tells us that physical reality is inconsistent. I don't think that's true. Some people hear quantum mechanics that way. I guess I don't. But look, let's suppose that in 100 years' time, we came up with a theory which said that kind of fundamental reality, beyond anything we can observe, is inconsistent, but we have a mathematical theory of this which predicts that things will behave thus and such. And the predictions are consistent. The theory might not be consistent, but the empirical predictions are consistent. So we would have some reason to suppose that ultimate reality or submicroscopic reality or whatever is inconsistent, because our theory gives us, because our theory tells us like that, and it makes these predictions. So, I mean, in some sense, this is kind of analogous to what's happened in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics tells us that subatomic reality is really strange, stranger than anyone could possibly have guessed, right? But hey, it makes all these wonderful predictions that are verified. And the fact that subatomic reality behaves in a strange way doesn't mean that, people and doors and mountains and planets behave in this rather strange way. It's just that the strange things are located to these very, very small things. Well, suppose in 100 years' time, we had a theory which said that sort of ultimate reality for microscopic reality was inconsistent, but it gave us the right kind of predictions in the same way. Now, what would it be rational to do in that context? I think that the rational thing will be to do that. Hey, you know, this is our best physical theory. It tells us that reality is like that. Now, I'm not suggesting we've got any theories in that ballpark at the moment, but if ever such a theory did turn up, I think that would be, you know, the reaction of physicists, because physicists have always been opportunists when it comes to mathematics. Someone once said to me, and I'll give you the clean version of this, physicists use mathematics like the sailors use a port when they dock. Okay, they just help themselves to anything they want. Okay, and physicists have always done that. You know, if there's a piece of mathematics on the shelf that seems to work, they'll use it. If not, they'll try to construct the mathematics. Now, one really interesting development in paraconsistent logic nowadays is a phenomenon called paraconsistent mathematics. So there are bits of mathematics which now investigate inconsistent mathematical structures. And we have quite a good understanding of what some of these are like: inconsistent geometries, inconsistent arithmetics, inconsistent linear algebras. This area of mathematics is still in its infancy, but we've got, you know, enough to know that there are interesting things that are happening here, and many more things are probably going to happen. In 100 years' time, we're going to have some fairly sophisticated theories of inconsistent mathematical structures. And if the sort of scenario I've described to you about physical reality turning out to be inconsistent is going to happen, it's going to be because I think at some stage in the future development of science, the mathematicians are going to find that one of these bits of inconsistent mathematics is exactly what they need. Just as, you know, they found that group theory was exactly what they needed to deal with special relativity 100 and whatever it is, 11 years ago. Now, that's all wildly speculative, and I'm not suggesting this is the case, but I'm just putting it to you that this is a way that, in the end, people could come to the view that physical reality, albeit at a kind of a micro level, was inconsistent. And, you know, I don't think that the thought that something like this could happen is actually implausible, given all the bizarre things that have happened to mathematics and physics in the last 150 years.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's bewildering when you start to read about developments in mathematics with, you know, beginning with people like Cantor, and when you start to try and get your head around things about like hierarchies of infinities, and then non-Euclidean geometries, non-classical logics, exotic string theories and types of physics and stuff. It's very difficult to know what you can hold on to, and I kind of I feel that this Quinean idea that, well, everything's up for negotiation, right? Some things just take a lot more persuading than others, and I think that, yeah, I think you're quite right that in the right circumstances, I could see the same sort of developments happening. Very, very strong predictive power, proving itself over and over again. Yeah, only consistent theories, then sure.
I think that part of the Quinean view is sort of right. It's not just, I mean, in another sense, in science you have got something to hold on to. You've got the empirical predictions, right? Now, of course, they're soft, we can overturn them, but it's that, in some sense, our physical theory must answer to our experimentation, our observations, is what makes the difference between physics and, well, maybe theology, maybe not. That's probably a contentious question. But certainly, our experimental results put a constraint on physical theorization, or scientific theorization in general, which prevent it from being sort of completely arbitrary. But, you know, our theories of matter have changed, our theories of the mathematical theory of space have changed, our theories of What else has changed? Well, certainly our theory of the fundamental nature of matter has changed. All these things have changed radically over the last 2,000 years. And, you know, you'd be crazy to suppose they haven't stopped changing.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so maybe, so here's a nice segue then, given that we are, I guess we can say that you have to be open-minded to some extent, given the kind of intellectual climate over the last 150 years or so, in that lots of preconceived dogmas have been overturned. Some new dogmas, like in classical logic, have been introduced and then overturned at the same time, like the idea of explosion and whatnot.
Well, it's more contentious than it was.
Sure, yeah, okay, great. So, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the idea of pluralism, because it seems to me that still you take what might be considered to be the kind of traditional view on this. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but you in some senses, a monist about logic in that you think there's kind of a right logic, and not just, if this is even the right way of saying the thesis of logical pluralism, which is that there are lots of different notions of validity, and they're all kind of on par or something. You're of the view that there is that right? You're a monist when it comes to logic?
Yes, but you have to hear that right.
Sure.
I mean, logical pluralism is a very trendy debate at the moment, a very interesting one. And what exactly it means to be an interesting debate is unclear. I'm refereeing papers on this where people argue about how best to understand these claims. And there are certain things that it clearly does not mean. Okay, so most people distinguish between deductive logic and non-deductive logic, inductive logic. And most people are going to be pluralist about this. I am. There are lots and lots of theories of validity. Yeah, we've got lots now, but this is not historically novel. There have been lots of theories of validity going back to ancient Greece, let alone in the Middle Ages. So there's a plurality there, and no one's going to deny that. That's obvious, right? So then you start to worry about what pluralism means if it's going to be interesting philosophically. And there are possibly different ways you can do this. I find the most plausible and interesting articulation something like this: that you need one kind of logic to reason about one kind of thing and a different kind of logic to reason about something else. So you might want to use, I don't know, classical logic to reason about the physical world, intuitionist logic to reason about mathematical constructions, paraconsitent logic to reason about truth. That could well be the case. I mean, that's an interesting philosophical position. So there are other articulations of pluralism, but let's just focus on this for the moment, because I guess I found that this most interesting articulation. The question then becomes is whether you really need more than one logic to do justice to the reasoning about these various domains. How would you tell what the right theory is to reason about particular domains? Well, you've got to worry a bit about what the domain is like. You've got to worry about the kind of results it gives you. You've got to worry about the grounds for the. You've got to worry about the conclusions that the logic's going to give you, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's going to be a difficult question, but the fact that there's no easy argument from the thought that different logics are appropriate for different areas to logical pluralism for the following reason. Let's go back to the discussion we were having earlier about classical logic applied to consistent situations, which is right. Now, Look, when I do a bit of classical mathematics, I reason classically. When I reason about truth, I reason paraconsistently. Am I a logical pluralist? No, because I think when I'm reasoning about a consistent situation, like a bit of classical mathematics, I'm not changing my logic. What I'm doing is sort of just imposing some extra principles, which are not sort of logically valid as such, but they're kind of features of the nature of this domain. Call them metaphysical or mathematical or whatever you want. So if you believe that there's a sort of one general logic, that's perfectly compatible with using a kind of more restricted logic for a special case, and that does not make you a pluralist. It just means that you can add some extra kind of so-called, well, so to say, contingent claims about the domain you're reasoning about. So you cannot just get to logical pluralism like that. You're going to need a much, much stronger argument. So sometimes at this point, logical pluralists say, yeah, but I mean, if you look at all these domains, your most general domain is going to have no logic, nothing logically valid in it. Well, I've never seen a plausible argument for this. If someone made a plausible argument to me, I think I would say, hey, you know, you've done. Yeah, I agree with you now. But I've never seen a plausible argument for this. What I've seen is lots of arguments which say, hey, we know there are lots of logical theories, you know, classical logic, intuitionist logic, paraconsistent logic, syllogistic, and they don't seem to have anything much in common. And that's true. But then we're not talking about the theories. We agree there's a plurality of those. What's at issue is whether, you know, there really is a plurality of domains and a plurality of correct logics for each of those domains, and the intersection of all those is empty. That I've never seen an argument for.
So, well, so at this stage, I mean, I think what you just said then seems very reasonable, and I'm certainly not going to try and contest that. But what it leads me to wonder about is whether or not. Okay, so how do you view? Well, sorry, let me try and say this question as clearly as possible. In the physics case, you might say, look, there's lots of different types of physics out there as well, right? And you know, just pick a load of these physical theories that have been proposed in the past. But it seems natural to kind of be a monist about physics. At least you want to say something like, well, one of these theories captures the way that the world is, or something.
Yeah, right? There's only one reality, and for better or worse, this is it. Yeah,
right. And so, but I think with the logic case, it's not as straightforward as that. One hypothesis on the table is that it is as straightforward as that, of course, which is something like that. Well, if the world is like this, then that's what the logic is going to be like. It's sort of arbitrated in the same way. But then I guess there's another view of logic, which is, let's call it, I don't know, a realist view of logic or something, which is that it's somehow describing reality at some general level. And then there's another view, which would be something like the thing that it's describing, the thing it's latching onto is some conceptual or something, right? It's to do with the way that I think. And I guess there's a third position, which is that the thing that it latches onto is the way that we speak or something as well, a linguistic view on top of that. And I wonder whether you find that a helpful way of thinking about that, and if so,
well, I guess I don't see it in any of those three ways. So let me tell you how I do see it, and you can tell me if it's one of those three or a fourth. Logic is a theoretical topic, so we construct theories of what follows from what. And if you look at the history of the development of logic in the last 2,500 years, there have been many theories which give very different results. So, you know, classical logic is not a generalization of syllogistic. Classical logic actually contradicts syllogistic, or more generally, the kind of general picture of traditional logic which arose in the Middle Ages out of syllogistic and the square of opposition and immediate inferences and so on. They just give contradictory results. So, you know, we know there are lots of contradictory. We know there are lots of theories of the nature of logic which contradict each other, and that's bloody obvious. At the end of being the 21st century, we've got 7 different logics, but it's always been like this. So, how do we go about figuring out which is the right theory? This takes us back to a previous stage of the discussion, because when you choose a theory, you choose a theory which is kind of most adequate to the data, but that's not going to settle it. You also want the theory is simplest, most fruitful, most unifying, etc., etc., etc. So when we choose which theory is correct, then it's just a particular case of the most general theory, most general phenomenon of theory choice. And the methodology of theory choice is pretty uniform, I think, across all areas in which we theorize, whether it's physics, metaphysics, morality, logic, I don't know. So that's how I think we choose the best theory. Now, the possibility of logical pluralism adds an extra dimension to this debate, because we now face the question of do we choose, can we get a logic which is going to work everywhere, or are we in the end forced to suppose that, as I put it before, different domains of reasoning require different logics? So this is kind of meta debate, okay? It's not about how you choose the logic, it's whether you need to choose more than one logic.
Yeah.
Now, that's a meta debate. So in a sense, it's a kind of a debate at the next level up, at the meta level. How do you resolve that debate? Well, you can, you choose between those two theories by the usual criteria of theory choice. So that's how I see logic, and how logical monism and pluralism fits into this picture. I'm not quite sure whether this picture is one of the 3 that you mentioned, or whether it's a 4th.
No, well, I mean, so it seems to me that if you were to be a pluralist about things, then you might not have to pick between any of the options that I outlined. And in fact, you could say that there's many more options than those 3 that I presented, because you could just say that logics have their own purpose or something, and a certain purpose, a certain logic will be the correct one. But when I think it seems to me, if you're a monist about things, then this seems to me this question presents itself, which is, well, why is that logic the correct one? I mean, like, what is it about, I want to say the world, but that seems to be already picking one of the options. But what's deciding that that's the right one?
I know what you mean. Look, the answer to that question is going to depend on your theory of validity. So theory of validity is not something which says, here's a list of the inferences, tick these and cross those. If you look at the theories of validity that we have and we've had for thousands of years, they explain not only which things are valid, which inferences are valid and which are not, but why. And there are various possible answers to this. So typically, in contemporary terms, someone who is an inferentialist will give a very different answer from someone who defines validity in terms of a model theory. So in the model theory, you're going to define validity as truth, preservation of all these models, all these situations. And then you ask yourself, well, what's a situation? Well, it's a mathematical structure. So the definition of validity looks to be something as like talking about what happens in a mathematical structure. So it's a theory about that bit of the world, if you like. If you're an inferentialist, so you say, well, we're going to define validity in virtue of a bunch of inferences that we hold, which, some people do, especially people who like intuitionism, then what makes something valid is the fact that these inferences are kind of the ones we operate with, or maybe have to operate with in virtue of the way our words mean. You can push this both ways. But it's that kind of thing which is going to give you an answer to sort of the more sort of fundamental questions towards which you're pushing in your initial trichotomy.
Okay. I mean, I'm not convinced that my question is the right one, or really a sensible one.
Oh, I think it is. I think it is. You know, theorizing validity is bloody hard. There are no simple answers. People disagree about what's valid, why it's valid, and you know, there are very good theories which answer these questions quite differently. And choosing between them is no easy matter. You know, there's no algorithm which is going to settle the matter. And, you know, probably logicians are going to disagree about these things for quite a long time, probably indefinitely. But it's that's going to address the question about whether validity is telling something about structures in the world, or maybe the mathematical world, or whether they're to do with the way that we must think, or whether it's to do with the way that we use our words. You know, all these views are possible, and none of them is obvious.
Yeah, okay, right, fair enough. I think that seems like, I mean, that's certainly where I am. I find these very confusing to know how to go in any direction at this point. I feel like an agnostic sort of stance is the only even remotely sensible seeming thing to do, which is basically just to say that I don't know which choice to make. But anyways, it's heartening to know that you don't think it's a stupid question.
Actually not. And look, I take it you're not really a professional logician, right? So these are questions about which professional logicians don't really have any agreed answer to at the moment. You know, the monism, pluralism debate, the inferentialism, monotheoretic debate, these are live issues amongst logicians, let alone people who just take an interest in the subject like yourself. But I think we're actually at a really, really interesting time in the historical development of logic, just because the recent technical developments in logic, in proof theory, in model theory, in classical logic, non-classical logic, in monism, pluralism, have opened up so many new questions that the landscape has become so much richer than it was possible when we had sort of the very, you know, limited developments of traditional logic or just classical logic. So the whole area is really exciting. I mean, it's in a state of flux at the moment, and you know, I think this is a very interesting, exciting time for logicians to be alive. Now, you know, that might be not quite the same as saying this is a very interesting time for someone in the United States to be alive in virtue of his politics. I don't think it's quite like that. But logicians are strange beasts, and they get excited by these intellectual changes. So all I'm saying is, you know, it's a very exciting time for a logician to be alive. And yeah. I'm happy I'm here now, and not, you know, in the first half of the 19th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, look, I think that is as good a place as any for us to draw this conversation to an end. So I'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to come on and for what's been a fascinating conversation. So yes, thanks very much, Graham.
You're most welcome. And I hope your viewers can get something out of this.
I suspect most of them will want to lie down in a dark room for a bit to try and get over it.